All right, welcome back. And we are into the home stretch here with the policy roundtable. Thanks, everybody. So with us for the roundtable, we have the same set of patient experts and clinical experts. And I would also like to welcome a couple new voices here. I know Tony is with us. So Tony, why don't you just say hi and introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thrilled to be here. I'm Tony Van Couverlet. I'm a family medicine physician by training. I'm the Executive Medical Director for Healthcare Services Corporations for Enterprise Medical Operations with the pharmacy team.
Welcome. I don't think we've met before, but thank you for being part of this meeting. I think they threw you into the lion's den, didn't they?
Dr. Wetherill is traveling, so he asked me to step in for this.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Mindy Bauer with Ipd Analytics. Are you with us yet?
I am with you. Can you see me okay?
Yes, I can.
All right.
Just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Mindy Bauer. I'm a pharmacist at Ipd Analytics, and we provide insight to payers, manufacturers, all sorts of subscribers. So I'm happy to be on the panel today.
Okay, great. So Dr. Wexler is with us. Tanya is with us. Melanie is with us. David Zimmer, why don't you please come on camera and introduce yourself?
Can you guys see me?
There you are. Yes.
David Zimmer. I'm an employee at Amgen. I'm a vice president of our U.S. Value and Access organization, responsible for value marketing, coverage and pricing, as well as execution. Okay,
great. So we've got now Kyle Hvidston from Sanofi is, I think, still not on the call yet, back from the break. So we will let you know when he's available. But we're going to now put down the slides and just so we can have a better view of everybody. And if the Midwest CEPAC, just for the time being, can go off camera, that's helpful. So now I can see the faces of the policy roundtable folks right in front of me. Okay, great. As I mentioned, I kind of want to start with disparities, and then we'll get into some of the clinical issues and the coverage issues, because we have a lot to talk about. But Tanya, I honestly didn't want to let go without acknowledging your comment earlier and making sure we explored it. You said we're not asking the right questions. And I always feel like we're here asking, how do we bring new, exciting, innovative treatments in to help patients at a price that they and the system can afford and make the whole system work for everybody? How are we not asking the right questions?
Oh, Steve, that's a difficult question for me to answer in one fatal swoop. I think that, the way in which the questions were framed for the panel today makes it extremely difficult. Clearly, they voted in favor of net benefit of Tezepelumab from a clinical perspective for some patients. But then when you ask the question specifically around Tezepelumab versus Dupixent, Tezepelumab versus omalizumab, and then the Tezepelumab versus Dupixent on steroid dependency. It was that buildup that led me to that moment of saying, when you ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answers. And so I want to make sure that it's in context, because that was kind of the buildup to my statement. I think the right question is, how do we get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time with the fewest barriers? Because that's the best thing for the system as a whole, and definitely for individual patients.
All right, so we will definitely come back to that question when we talk about the coverage aspects and as you know as well as anybody, how the system is working and how it might work differently, and we'll talk about some of those aspects. So thank you for clarifying, and I know we will come back in a way that I think will do justice to your good question. But I want to start off with the fact that I thought another good question that honestly hasn't been asked, although it's been kind of alluded to, is kind of, we're here talking about what's going to be a relatively expensive new treatment. Should we have spent the whole day talking about the homes and the socioeconomic factors and all the other things that make asthma a huge burden for so many patients in this country? And we could, there are meetings that have spent a lot of time trying to help identify those issues and trying to address them. There are a lot of great programs. I can remember when it was this radical idea to use health insurance money to pay for air conditioners for people with asthma and to get them into the inner cities as the most effective treatment you could do for people with asthma, et cetera. So we can talk about that, but I also want to think specifically in some ways about a treatment like Tezepelumab, poised to enter treatment. We certainly had Dupilumab, we've had Omalizumab and Mepolizumab, et cetera, but we're going to talk about Tezi. And if we look forward and we want to try to frame some recommendations or at least perspectives, what could each of the major stakeholders do to try to help us introduce a treatment like this in a way that would reduce disparities? You know, what would manufacturers do? What would payers do? What would clinicians do? What would the patient groups, themselves do? So I wonder if we have some thoughts on that. I'll open it up first. I have some notes written down here, a little bit for almost each of those groups, but I'm wondering if anybody has a place they'd like to start. And it could be a request to be made of one of the other stakeholders. What do we do to try to help with the disparities and change that vote around that came out of the CEPAC? The CEPAC said, given the way the structure and the system and the world works, we're going to introduce this thing and it might even make disparities worse. How do we change that? Who wants to take a crack at it? How about Melanie? Melanie, you get to go first this time.
Okay, great. So just back to one of the points that you started to make about the other factors that impact asthma control. I think it is important to acknowledge that there is no perfect treatment out there for asthma. You know, regardless of what treatment you're on, you're still going to encounter your triggers. And asthma is a disease that requires the cooperation of the mankind around you to help you manage and control your disease. You can spend your entire day managing and avoiding your triggers to the best of your ability, taking your medicines, et cetera. And all it takes is your neighbor smokes cigarettes and that gets into your home. Or, you know, there's a careless gender reveal party that sparks a wildfire 2 states away from you. You know, things that are out of your control, you're relying on everyone else around you to be responsible and to help us improve what our environments are like. You know, people with severe asthma have trouble even going to a store because
Melanie,
you know, the opportunities are endless for other people's. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, you were breaking up just a little bit, but you're back. Keep going.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say the opportunities are endless for other people's actions to impact your asthma health. And so I think that that's important for us to remember, even as we're addressing the inequities that exist, right? Because there are things that we can be doing all around to help improve asthma health.
All right. Let me jump in with one then. I wonder, let's see. I'm trying to think, who should I ask first on this one? But I want to see, actually, I wanted to ask, well, let me start with the manufacturers, because I mean, you guys have heard this before about the unrepresentativeness of the clinical trials. And without throwing a first stone, tell us, like, why? What's going on with that? What are the barriers to doing what we all kind of each meeting now are saying, which is we need more representative trials? We'll talk about what we need to get there maybe, but why isn't it already happening? Why hasn't it happened already? There must be some real world financial or other reasons that this hasn't happened. Kyle, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the key issues that we need to solve together, in that it won't be any one part of the healthcare system, but it is a system-wide issue. You know, the fact brought up earlier about the experience we're having with COVID vaccines is informative, because often we do point first, I think, to economics and things that might be getting in the way of someone seeking better care and adhering to better care. I don't think it's as simple as that. But what we have been doing about it is first recognizing the vast inequalities that do exist, and looking at ways we can make a difference in our trials, as I talked about earlier, in terms of locating sites outside of the traditional locations, which have historically been academic medical centers, and selecting our investigators differently. So with the target of them being more inclusive. That's how we develop the medicines, and then how those medicines affect clinical practice. Thinking of ways of getting better data to understand who's using them, who's adhering to them, and what are, most importantly, what we could better understand are the reasons why someone is not meeting and continuing at their therapeutic goal. That's something that everyone agrees is an urgent issue. So we're interested in learning more about this, and we're interested in partnering with others to make a difference.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I was just going to make a comment around diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. We have 2 current PCORI engagement awards, one with the African American asthma community and one with the Hispanic Latino asthma community. And what we hear consistently is that absolutely there is mistrust in this community. And it is well-founded. We have to acknowledge, if you will, the sins of the past that have built that foundation of mistrust. And that once we do that, and then we begin to address some of the more systemic issues in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs that even Melanie spoke about before, food insecurity, housing insecurity, education, poverty, all of those things have to be addressed before you can anticipate or expect someone to self-actualize or be empowered in their healthcare. So if you're trying to, in that fight or flight mode, determine how you're going to put a roof over your head or clothes on your back or food on your table, you can't think 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road about optimizing your health outcomes.
All right, that's a good point. So, and one of the things that you said made me think, we often talk about recruitment, but one of the things that PCORI's been trying to do, and that I applaud everything that you've just mentioned that you're doing with them, is to think of engagement as starting way upstream, right? It could be that patient groups need to get involved in the design of the trial and talking about the outcome measures and talking about what's realistic for follow-up. Because if you have to follow up too often and folks don't have transportation, they're going to say, well, I can't do that. So we have to have some other way to do it. So there are lots of things that we have to, I think, start doing way before we talk about recruitment. And I think you would agree with that. And David, I also want to offer you the opportunity because, let me just pose the cynic's view, which would be nothing's going to happen until the FDA tells you you've got to. But if the FDA said, I'm sorry, we're not going to accept another pivotal trial that has lower than the prevalent population in the US of certain kind of populations, just don't even start. It would happen overnight. And is that what it's going to take? Should the FDA do that?
I don't think that will be necessarily what it requires. However, you raise an interesting point. I think that to date, there has been a very practical approach in terms of speed to patients on these trials. However, in recognition of this, one of our strategic pillars to ensure that we do achieve health equity is we stood up a group called RISE for Representation in Clinical Research that in order to mandate to improve the proportional representation of these underrepresented populations in our clinical trials. And one of the first trials, or one of the first developments for this is a real world evidence phase 4 trial that we're close to initiating for Tezepelumab to address some of the inequities that you've described.
Great, that's great. Okay, I'm swinging around kind of quick.
I'm sorry, if I could add something.
Sure, Tony, go ahead.
Sure. Just to let you know, I think a big part of this as well is knowledge, and there is no knowledge without the data. And gathering the data, on the payer side is part of the crux of the. And prior to being with the pharmacy team here, I've spent the past 4 years as medical director for our Illinois plan. And across the organization, we've been partnering with our facilities and our value-based care groups to gather race, ethnicity, and language data and take a look at that with their quality metrics to see, are there any disparity? And and for our groups to then, to see. And, I think all of us that have worked in healthcare have known for years that the disparities are there. And not that I'm looking for anything good to have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but when we started this in 2020, asking these groups to be reporting to us on things like this, in Q1, they were saying back to us, really, what you want us to be doing this, so on and so forth. We met with them in Q2 after the country had gone into lockdown, and they were like, oh my gosh, we see the value in this and everything. And so I think that's a big component of it as well that everybody needs to understand is you have to start getting that data so you can start seeing where are the inequities. And as I would tell our groups as well, and if there aren't inequities, well, then you have a right to sing your praises that there aren't any inequities in your group, for the communities that you're serving as well.
Thanks. I was actually going to pitch you an idea too, and I might come back to this FDA idea, but we raised at a recent meeting the idea that health plans could look at an opportunity like the introduction of something like Tezepelumab and say, what if we created our own quality measure for ourselves? It could be somebody else outside, but it could be ourselves. And we want to look in a year and see whether the use of that drug is representative across, the groups that we would want it to be if it's being distributed and used equitably. Because as you said, if you're not going to measure it, no one's ever going to be able to improve upon it, et cetera. But what do you think of the idea of what could be called a quality measure of equitable uptake of a new treatment like Tezepelumab? Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it would help?
I think it's feasible. I don't know how feasible it is in the short term because of systems that would have to be designed and looking for with any measure, you want to have some sort of national standard, and usually when you're doing quality metrics, the first couple of years of it is, as you're all aware of, is the discovery phase, is to see, what is the lay of the land that's out there, and building it so that people that are participating in it understand that this is not, it's a measure where we want you to be reporting, not necessarily hitting certain thresholds. You have to do that discovery piece of it.
Yeah.
But I think it would need to be built with a short-term goal and then a long-term goal as well as to what you would want to be looking for.
Okay, it's good. I mean, part of the reason I raised both the FDA idea and this one is that it's going to cost money. It's going to take time and effort. And unless it's some kind of universal requirement, we all know that it's hard to do that because it costs time and money and it's aspirational until it has to be done. And then maybe over time it becomes more the norm. So it's worth thinking about whether we might have to make certain requirements or measurements mandatory in a way to kind of get the ball moving in the right direction. Let me swing over to Mike. Michael, are you with us still? You are, right? Dr. Wexler? I just haven't seen his picture. So I wonder if he's not with us.
I am still with you. I am
There
still with
you
you.
are.
I'm sorry about that. Sorry.
You're still looking as young and optimistic and smiling as you have all day long. I've aged considerably today. You look exactly the same. I wanted to ask you, okay, let's put this kind of idea on the clinician's plate. So I guess, or provider group or integrated group. If we know that a lot of patients need to have care in their own community and it might be hard for them to get to a specialist or whatever, you mentioned that these drugs are going to probably through prior auth be required to be given by a specialist, but some of those payers might say, or in conjunction with a specialist. So is there a role for the clinical world, especially integrated systems, to say we are going to set up telehealth or some other mechanisms through which people who are getting care in their own local community don't have to come to the academic center, don't have to try to get in contact with a new specialist, and can somehow even be treated by a primary care doctor in conjunction with a specialist somewhere else. That also takes time, money, and effort. But do you think the clinical community, do you think that would make sense? Do you think this is the type of treatment for which that kind of hub and spoke approach through telehealth or some other thing would work?
It possibly could for people who truly have a hard time with access. And we saw during COVID that we can make it happen with telehealth and increasing access to people who, live further away and whatnot. And we made it more feasible for that to happen for these prescriptions. That being said, I'll say as a clinician, it is a lot harder to do that kind of evaluation. It's one thing when I know the patient, but it's a lot harder when I don't know the patient because there's so many other aspects of things that could be going on. And when I see the patient, I do, I look at their lung function. That's something that can't be done remotely. I look at to see about other comorbidities, and I'll do a chest X-ray. I'll do all sorts of testing because I want to make sure that the person that I'm prescribing the biologic to truly merits it, and that there isn't something else that I can try to fix and work on. So I think it's feasible if you know the patient and if there's no other options. On the other hand, it's not optimal.
Okay. No, it's important to know sometimes, obviously, or all the time, when aspirations need to be viewed in context of some really important limitations or risks, unintended risks.
Yes.
Tanya or Melanie, absolutely going to come to you guys.
Sorry,
Have
I'm just going to sort of echo a couple of things that Dr. Wexler said. So number one, again, I put this in the chat earlier, 40% of severe asthma patients are currently managed by an asthma specialist. So that means 60% are not. Right.
Incredible.
I mean, that really is unfortunate. And if we look at other systems throughout the world where they do have these centers of excellence and the models that we discussed for helping to identify the patients that currently are uncontrolled using too much steroid, too much SABA, even on high dose ICS LABA, there are ways to better identify these patients and make sure that they get to that level of specialty care. But it does take systemic change, just as Tony mentioned. And so I think that we have to begin to think about, again, how do we put those systems in play and begin to put certain quality standards and metrics into the system, the red flags, if you will, to get the right patient to that level of care.
By the way, a real quick anecdote. When I was knee-high to a grasshopper just out of medical school, doing a little research project, the hospital, or actually the insurer, was interested. Why are our patients ending up in the emergency room? There must be a clinical gap going on. They're not on their inhaled steroids. They don't have a clear warning system for when to use more or less. So we did a research project and we went looking at every single ED visit and then investigated why. Were they on the right doses? Had they had the right follow-up? 96% of the patients in the ED had everything done right. Why were they in the ED? Actually, this was captured in our electronic medical record. Their son had been arrested and they just had a life emergency and had not been able to take their medications. Or there was domestic abuse, or there was a loss of a job, or there was, life intersected with this beautiful kind of clinical model of what it takes to help patients with severe asthma. So all of that we're talking about in terms of helping with disparities, I guess I just wanted to also ring the bell that it really has to be done in a way in which we see healthcare as a very broad enterprise of helping people with their life, because asthma is there 24 hours a day, and whatever's going to mess with your life is going to make your asthma worse. All right, that was my little soapbox. I would like to come back to the pricing issue. I know Kyle and David, you'll be disappointed to hear that issue is coming back around. But for the short term, I do want to talk a little bit about the clinical care issues, because I think that will feed into the coverage issues. And I want to frame how and why we're going to talk about the coverage issues. But in the short term, Mike, you get to have a very big soapbox yourself right now, because you happen to be the only clinical expert on this phase of the meeting with us. Let's talk about that phenotyping issue. Basically, do you need access to every single one of these treatments for any patient? Or since, there's a lot of, can't really tell right now, there's a lot of overlap in their effectiveness for Tezzy and Dupi among certain groups, maybe Tezzy and OMA and others. Tell us about what your ability to decide based on biomarkers or other clinical factors, whether there's a right drug to start each of these patients on, or whether you think it's reasonable to think that you could start, between Tezzy and Dupi, you could be asked to use either one and then use the other one, perhaps if the first one didn't work. How specific is your clinical care at this stage?
Are you asking me that question? Was that a yes?
Yes, I am.
So I think it's, you know, I can say in the absence of Tezi, it's critical to do a very formal evaluation to identify the dominant biomarker that, and that's what really helps me choose between one therapy versus another. We've left out of the discussion the anti-IL-5s, but you know, they're pertinent as well. You want to know what is the type of asthma that an individual has, whether they've got eosinophil IL-5 mediated asthma, whether they have nitric oxide IL-4 or IL-13 mediated asthma, whether they've got an IgE mediated asthma, to help you decide. And for many of the patients, it may not make a difference, one versus the other, but there probably are subtle differences that will allow you to determine which is the best therapy. Now, with regard to Dupilumab versus Tezi, you know, will it make a difference? It might, if I identify, you know, that there is a dominant biomarker. So for instance, the nitric oxide level is, you know, 200, and that's IL-13 mediated, and the other biomarkers are normal, then, you know, I would probably choose Dupi over Tezi. That being said, if the biomarkers are all sort of in the moderately elevated range, the eosinophils are 300, the IgE level is 300, the ENO is 30, I don't think you'd go wrong with either one, and it may not make a difference. And so it's a challenge, but I think it is critical. Similarly, if the eosinophil count is 1200, I'm less likely to use Tezi and I'm more likely to use benralizumab or mepolizumab.
Okay. And how about the issue around steroids? You heard that long discussion and vote around Dupi versus Tezi on steroids. And I know your view of it from the source, you helped provide a lot of nuance to the understanding on that. If a payer came to you and said, we're going to use Tezi only at first, you have to use Tezi first to get to Dupi. Do you feel that that would be clinically ridiculous? Or could you make the argument that I could try Tezi, and if it doesn't work, I can move to Dupi? Are there any patients for whom that would just really not make sense?
I would say you could probably use either one, and step to the other one.
Okay. We will come back to that then, because I think it'll be part of the crux of Tanya's question and others too, around the right drug at the right time to the right patient, and payers kind of intersecting job or role, you know, to try to strike a good bargain. And if you can get a good bargain by getting a lower price only if that drug gets to be used first, that's the way the current market works, as one way to try to, again, keep things more or less affordable. So let's move to coverage policy. And again, we're not here to try to create a roadmap to you know, how you do coverage in a way. We want to make sure that when payers and others hear this conversation in our report, they get perspectives on different approaches to coverage that are going to be considered. Because we all know that people will consider step therapy. They'll consider different things about the coverage criteria that I'm going to kind of walk through. And I'm going to hope to get different perspectives on what people should be aware of, thoughtful about, warned about, encouraged about, as we think about different ways that the insurance coverage policy can be written. And I know Tezi isn't covered yet, is not approved yet. So I got some documents just to help guide me. I've got Dupilumab. So we could say the way that insurers have handled Dupilumab in the way the insurance criteria are written will be probably a strong guide to what we should expect when Tezepelumab gets approved in some ways. And so I want to raise some questions for all of you as we go through the different stages in a way, or different phases, parts of an insurance coverage policy. So first out of the box, diagnosis. When you read an insurance coverage policy, the first section usually says diagnosis. Now, interestingly, I'm looking at two major carriers. One of them, all it says is the doctor has to say that the patient has moderate to severe asthma. The other one says the patient has to have one or the other. Has to have FEV1 less than 90% or FEV1 reversibility of at least 12% after albuterol. So there are different approaches by major payers around whether you have, oh, and by the way, I should have mentioned, the insurer that didn't require FEV1 measurements says you have to have ED visit or hospitalization to be moderate to severe asthma. So these are not fly-by-night operations. It's publicly available information, but it probably doesn't matter that much which insurers they are. But let's go through the diagnosis. Michael, I guess I'll start with you again. Do you think that an insurer is reasonable to create a diagnostic criterion in this area? The FDA is likely to label it if it follows other examples. It's either going to say moderate to severe or severe, and that's all it will say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very reasonable to have some kind of diagnostic criteria to identify that the person truly has asthma. And that would, necessitate going to see a specialist. And the diagnosis of asthma usually revolves around both having asthma symptoms, cough, shortness of breath, chest tightness, wheeze, and some degree of airflow obstruction, and usually a component of reversible airflow obstruction. And the reversible airflow obstruction is what you alluded to, the 12% reversibility post a bronchodilator. I don't think that's unreasonable.
Oh, Mike, you're right.
If you put hard and fast rules, you might put in some hard and fast rules. And so you don't want to exclude people. On the other hand, if they don't have asthma, they don't have asthma.
Okay. Do you have any specific vote, if you will, on the idea that for these patients, is it reasonable to require that they have inadequate asthma control as defined by hospitalization or emergency medical care visit in the last year, despite adequate treatment with high-dose inhaled corticosteroid, additional controller, and oral glucocorticoids? One of the payers says that's what you've got to have to be eligible for Dupilumab.
I would say that you need to have inadequate control as defined by either emergency room visit, hospitalization, and or at least 2 courses of oral corticosteroids for poorly controlled asthma. And that has to be in the context of being on an inhaled corticosteroid and some other controllers such as long-acting beta agonist.
Okay. Tanya, Melanie, others, anybody? Mindy, I know you can chime in now too. By the way, I could have introduced what Ipd Analytics does a little bit better, but Mindy has a catbird seat looking and consulting with multiple plans. So she has, in a sense, is a consultant to the stars and gets to hear what they're thinking and also has a view over the broader landscape of how policies are developed and why. So do you have any view on this aspect of the diagnostic criteria as you see it across? I was surprised. I just asked randomly of 2 plans, and the staff, the ones that they brought me, they approached it very differently. One didn't require any lung function tests, just that you had asthma and had been in the hospital. And so it was just completely 2 different lanes to go down in terms of coverage.
Yeah, so the payers, when they make these policies, their biggest resources are guidelines. And I think the ones that spelled it out with a little bit more detail just got it from the GINA guidelines. So I think they're dotting their I's, crossing their T's more in their policy by spelling out what is in the guidelines versus just leaving it up, to more trust in the doctor that they've properly diagnosed asthma and have used the guideline version of uncontrolled. So it is interesting that there's more detail in one than the other. And we see that a lot with payers, that the variability of the detail is it can be significant. But to diagnose severe asthma, the guidelines do say, you can have one of the following: 2 exacerbations requiring oral corticosteroids in the past 12 months, or 1 severe exacerbation requiring hospitalization. So those are pulled from the guidelines.
Good. So I just wanted to.
And by the way, those were the entry criteria for the TESE study.
Yes, I was actually going to
as well as most of the other biologic studies.
Absolutely. And that's the other, just kind of from a paradigm approach, just as Mindy said, plans will often go straight to the guidelines. They always do. They always want to go see what guidelines say. The other thing they do is they go straight to the clinical trial criteria. because the FDA might say something kind of bland, like moderate to severe, and they have 2 ways to define that in insurance criteria, 3 ways. One is to let the doctor just tick a box, moderate to severe. One is to use the guideline definition, and the third is to use the eligibility criteria from the pivotal trials. And sometimes those are exactly the same, those latter 2, and sometimes they're not. Tony, anything you wanted to add about the way that you view this?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said. The other thing that, being a family doc, like to tie everything together. I think another key thing about having the criteria, whether it be, the FEV1 or the emergency room or whatever you want to use, I think that also helps us get back to the health disparities and inequity piece. Because when you have these objective criteria, then you can say, well, this person should have been classified as severe asthma based on everything that's in your record or that you're submitting. And for whatever reason, the provider or the facility is not classifying that person with the correct diagnosis. And I think that's another thing that, what some people could say being overburdensome, there's a way to help use this to address other components that we're all working on as well.
Yeah. The other thing that we sometimes comment on is that, plans always have the choice to use one and or the other. And so if you want to create slightly broader criteria, you can say it's all these FEV1 criteria or in the hospital. Some will go just with one or the other. Just again, to kind of point out some of the variation that we tend to see. Now, when I look at the oral corticosteroid part, that's interesting too, because I'm just trying to see what the payers did. Well, basically the clinical trial, and Mike, you know this quite well, the eligibility criteria required that they had been on oral corticosteroids for more than 6 months. And I assume that you would feel that do you feel that would be reasonable for a health plan to include in its eligibility criteria?
Well, most people who've been on corticosteroids, I would say either that or, having the exacerbation criteria. I think even if someone has been on oral corticosteroids for 3 months, that would be probably sufficient.
Okay.
Yeah, and
go ahead. I was going to come back to you. But you always know when I'm coming back to you. So
I'm like,
yes.
I got to say something here, Steve. Again, I think that GINA 2021 is very clear. OCS should be a last resort, and that also the burden of those repetitive short bursts has that cumulative effect. And we heard that today from the experts and from the conversation. So I think that we have to reframe, and that you will see the guidelines likely continue to evolve to push OCS to a final step, and to make sure that we're not using it as kind of that. Could it help to flag the right patients for consideration of a biologic? Absolutely. But should it be a step through that you have to go through? I don't think so. Especially not 6 months.
I agree. Absolutely. Absolutely not. In this day and age, 2022 and beyond, really no one should be on oral maintenance corticosteroids. So that's why I would rather see someone on a biologic than on oral corticosteroids as maintenance.
All right. So this is going to be part of our perspective. That's very helpful. Then the other thing that I wanted to then ask is that, again, when a payer or anybody is trying to sort out how to write a policy, they will not only look at the inclusion criteria, they'll look at the exclusion criteria. And the only thing that stuck out there to me in the TESE studies is that they excluded people who'd had much of a smoking history. So just to raise the question again, and Mindy, I could ask you or Tony perhaps. So you see the exclusion criteria here: current smokers excluded, or patients with a smoking history of greater than 10 pack years in the past. Would a health plan basically cut and paste that into their coverage policy and exclude smokers from getting a biologic? And then I'll ask Mike if he thinks that that's reasonable. But what do you think of payer? What's the usual payer process there with that exclusion criteria?
I can start with this one. So no, I don't believe most payers will put that in. We do not see that currently with the other biologics in their criteria as well. And those are the patients that tend to need therapy the most as well. So I do not, even though that was an exclusion criteria, and a lot of times payers will go to inclusion exclusion criteria. From what we've seen with the other biologics and from payers, we do not, we don't see payers thinking about it like that and putting that in their policy.
Okay. Michael or Tanya or Melanie, any thoughts on that? I mean, you could imagine a clinician wanting any patient he's about, or she is about to start on a biologic, to stop smoking, because it's like, why are we using this medication, especially if it has some risks, if you're smoking, when we could do so much for you if you stopped. But from an insurance coverage perspective, do you think that should be part of the equation or not?
I don't think that it will become part of the equation. I don't think it should necessarily be part of the equation either. The reason it's there and the reason it's in the clinical trials is to ensure that you're giving it to people with asthma as opposed to COPD. And that's I think that's the major reason for it being in there, because people with more than 10-pack years smoking history are more likely to have, emphysema. There is this entity of asthma COPD overlap, but it's mostly to ensure that you're enrolling the right kinds of people that are more likely to be responsive to type 2 biologic therapy and or other therapies. So I don't think it will be included. I don't think it should be included. And I do think that most practitioners recognize the differences between asthma and COPD, particularly in heavy smokers. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to try this therapy in those patients if they do have an asthma component, but it just hasn't been studied in that patient population. So there might be some response. And there are ongoing studies with all the biologics in the COPD population going on right now. So far, what we've seen with some of the other therapies, incidentally, is much less efficacy in that type of patient population. Like for instance, in the mepolizumab and benralizumab COPD studies, where there was 50% reduction in exacerbations in asthma, it was 15 to 20% in COPD in patients with eosinophilic asthma and eosinophilic COPD. So to answer your question, I don't think it should be, and I don't think it will be an exclusion.
Okay. Let's come back to step therapy then. Mindy, what's the current pattern that you're seeing across plans in step therapy already? And have you done some thinking about what might happen with Tezepelumab? It probably depends on its price, but what are you seeing?
Read my mind.
Tell us what you're seeing and what you think.
Yeah, so with the biologics, well, yeah, they all have prior authorization and they all have step therapy with inhalers. So like a high dose inhaled corticosteroid plus another controller. So similar to like inclusion criteria in the trials that got these medications approved and in guidelines. So it all has to do with having to be on an inhaler and optimized on the inhaler. We do not see much at all step therapy between the biologics. So I think, it kind of reflects the heterogeneity of this population. And with these policies, they're not requiring, Dupy before you try mepolizumab or whatever. So they're not really stepping biologics with each other. But Steve, as you mentioned, the price, might introduce that if it's priced at a premium. It is bringing in a whole new patient population with low eosinophils that didn't have treatment before. So we haven't seen step therapy between the biologics themselves, but it could come with more competition and depending on the price.
Kyle or David, let me ask you, are you surprised at all? You're probably not, but tell me why you're not surprised that there hasn't been more therapy already in this space, like there is for psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis, where the doctors and the patients will say the same thing about heterogeneity of response and we need all the treatments. They will say that you can't know which patient will respond to which drug, better out of the box, but there's a ton of step therapy there. Why not here?
Yeah, Steve, I'll take a first shot at it before David. I think it reflects the heterogeneity of the disease and the heterogeneity of the different approaches. I'd say in the case of dupilumab, having a unique mechanism of action has been recognized. And that we feel has been a key criteria for making the access decisions that pertain to it. Much more than, sometimes these are influenced by rebating and other financial agreements that are confidential. And we hope going forward that as more options are available, that these become additive to the armamentarium, not reductive by forcing the economic issue to play a greater role in access. That would be unfortunate to follow the path of other therapeutic areas.
All right, you're teeing me up to talk more about the price, but I'll give you another pass on that for another few minutes. David, help me understand. I'm a hard-headed payer. Why haven't I already stepped these therapies?
No, I think that Kyle raised some great points there. One, in terms of the overall patient population, I think that's a very valid issue. In addition, if you look and compare it to RA or just the inflam class in general, tezepelumab would be the sixth competitor, more novel MOAs by comparison to when you look at RA and psoriasis. You have a number of TNFs, you have a number of IL-17s, you have greater than 20 different agents in the space. When you're a payer looking at that breadth of options, you really can drive negotiation on rebates in a much different fashion than you have to date. We will be seeking broader coverage to label, with an MOA that is unique at the top of the overall cascade, as well as, no phenotype or biomarker limitations. I think we introduce a very compelling product that you would hope allows for broad access to patients.
All right, we'll come back. I do know that, honestly, if we had, and I think you know this, if we had manufacturers of the treatments in the RAs.
This is Mike. I think there's a lot of heterogeneity.
So Mike, you're breaking up a bit from wherever you are right now.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
No,
I'm gonna dial in. I'm gonna dial in rather than be on the.
Okay. We trust you. It may be better. Thanks. Okay. All right, got it. Okay, I want to actually skip to one other part of the coverage policy, which is kind of the renewal criteria. Most biologics are covered, especially initially, just for like 6 months or so, and then there's a question of whether the doctors have to do something or the patient has to demonstrate something for continuation or renewal of coverage. Actually, before I ask that, then let me ask Melanie, because she had something she wanted to say. Go ahead, Melanie.
Oh, I just wanted to add, when we're talking about patients who may or may not have different phenotypes, but having the option to have your preference for your treatment. With the different biologics, they're delivered different ways. Some of them are in clinics, some of them are at home, some are delivered more often than others. And whatever we can do to reduce barriers to having a choice in what you use is important, because there will be a preference component that comes into it as well.
Thank you. That's another good point. Okay, so just quickly, I know this is a little bit in the weeds, but again, reauthorization can sometimes be a hassle for patients and doctors, sometimes not. But when I look at dupilumab, at least right now, it's pretty kind of the prescriber has to submit attestation. That's the easiest form of kind of prior auth usually, where the prescriber just says, yes, the patient is receiving benefit. And they have to show that they've decreased, the doctor has to say they have decreased rescue medication use. They've have had a decrease in the frequency of severe exacerbations. They have better, PFTs, pulmonary function tests, and reduced asthma-related symptoms. If they tick all 4 boxes, then they get approved to keep going. Tony, why, if it's that simple, why do it? Wouldn't the patient stop taking the drug if it weren't working for them? Why do you have to have the doctor tick those boxes in a sense? Or are you requiring documentation from the medical record? Walk us through your thinking on that phase of the coverage.
Well, I think you're wanting to ensure that, whatever is happening, one, that the individual is adherent, because we all know that's always a big component of it. And help reinforce the positive behavior of the member, of the individual who's receiving the treatment. It's part of the continuous quality improvement aspect of it, I think, too. If we're gathering all this data and people, or if we're treating with all these different medications and people aren't responding to it, how else are you going to know that unless you're doing some sort of monitoring of it? I do agree, that it is important to have it be as little of an administrative burden as possible. At HCSC, we've got the Epic payer platform where we're able to share records back and forth, from the payer to the provider's office, and we're doing other pilots as well for how we do authorizations where it's a more streamlined process as well. So I mean, I think it's something that's necessary, but I think we all together need to work on leveraging the technology aspects of it so that it moves faster.
Yeah. I mean, actually, ICER is putting out a report on barriers to fair access in just the week after Thanksgiving, actually. And unfortunately, we can look at the kind of the content of the policies and decide whether we think it lines up fairly with good access, but we can't look at the implementation phase, which in many ways can be equally or even more important. And Tanya, I was wondering, or Melanie, from your kind of advocacy roles, do you guys hear of problems for patients who are on a biologic and then hit the renewal phase and something goes wrong and they end up having to skip a dose or something? Are you hearing anything like that, or is it usually a pretty smooth process?
Occasionally. I mean, we have a full-time prior authorization certification specialist that helps patients to navigate that process at the network. And so certainly we get a volume of calls to support that person's time. But it's not always on the reauthorization. Sometimes it's on the front end of getting approved to begin therapy. But we do see these interruptions from time to time.
Okay. Now, Mike,
I would echo that.
Okay.
We also receive a lot of phone calls for people looking for help with that. And one example is Ben, who has severe asthma, shared that his insurance required the reauthorization, and the process prolonged him from getting that treatment for 5 months. So he had a 5-month interruption and then lost asthma control again. So it does happen, and it's incredibly demoralizing for the patients. It's also very difficult. It's time consuming sometimes. And not knowing how to navigate it can be frustrating, but it can also just, I guess just time consuming. People have described it as a part-time job, All
right, I'm going to come back to the provider criteria part of an insurance policy when Michael is back with us. So let me just check, partly because he could be on the phone and I may not know it. Mike, are you back with us yet? Okay. If not, I wanted to ask about another thing that I know does come up in terms of what patients need to grapple with, and that's the switching of insurer. And you guys could probably tell us again of anecdotes, but let's talk about that as an issue for insurers as well. And let's talk about how the system works. So Mindy, you may know more generally, but Tony, I could ask you specifically. So a patient comes in. Now in asthma, it sounds like we're not doing a lot of stepping. So, and I'm assuming that you probably cover all of the different biologics. So it doesn't sound like grandfathering, which is an old term that some people find offensive these days. So I should probably choose something else. Continuation on the prior treatment when they join you as an insurer. Is it an issue at all in the asthma space? Are you aware?
I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
To hear what the others have to say, but it's not anything that's raised.
This is where in the psoriasis or RA space where you do have a lot of steps, this is a bigger issue perhaps. But Tanya and Melanie, again, back to you. Are you hearing stories of people who are not able to continue insurance coverage for the drug that they're on as they switch insurers or not?
So what we hear more frequently is what we sort of in the ICS LAVA class of non-medical switching, right? Where they are because of the rebates and the negotiated formularies, but not as much in the biologic space at this point.
Okay. One step.
I have patients who do have that challenge, and we have to go through a whole pre-authorization process for those people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. It could be that it's actually covered, but they have to start over in terms of the prior auth process, which again could create a gap. Our fair access criteria require basically that plans allow coverage to continue while that kind of process is unfolding. They kind of have to have a phase where they continue coverage while that's unfolding. So we'll continue to make that point. All right. I want to talk a fair amount about research, but let's talk about the pricing aspects. And so to a certain extent, Kyle and David, back into your court on this. I want to ask one technical question first, perhaps, because some of these drugs are already approved, like Dupilumab, obviously, for multiple indications. And you pointed out, when we looked, ICER, when we looked at its use in atopic dermatitis, we said that the price did align well with the added benefit for patients. In this case, it doesn't. The same price, but in terms of how the model at least measures the benefits to patients, it doesn't line up well. So the cost effectiveness isn't right. And if we were pricing it by indication, the price for treating patients with asthma would need to be lower than the price to treat patients with atopic dermatitis. Should we do that? Should we send a signal to innovators that you're going to get a higher price when you show more benefits? And if you do have a higher benefit in a certain indication, you get that price. But if you don't get the same price, because it could be that your drug just works a smidgen for some conditions, and for others it's a huge benefit. Why should we have the same price for both?
Well, I'll speak to at least the philosophy Sanofi took in setting the price, and you alluded to some of it in that we conducted our own holistic value assessment, and that did align in the case of atopic dermatitis with ICERs, and we were pleased by that, to have that independent convergence, and that's part of how we launched the medicine in 2017. As we've mentioned in other meetings, there has not prevented the unfortunate discussion about rebates and what it takes to get access on behalf of affordable access on behalf of patients. So that was then, this is now, and I would say that the point about how we're looking at value relative to price really speaks to the importance of meetings like today, where we are able to do that. But we are able to do that in terms of viewing the evidence and knowing the price and knowing the net price to the extent that we can look at these things. But then the practical considerations of how these products are controlled through other parts of the system and distributed by other parts of the system, and the limited control actually even manufacturers have over that. So that's why it will take more cooperation, I think, in terms of aligning price and value. And I would say that the price in asthma is aligned with other asthma biologics, but we don't have control over what happens to the medicine when other parts of the system have ownership of it, nor should we, you could say, if it's owned by another part of it. So that's where I think the theory of how the evidence supports price and the agreements that are made over how that medicine gets to the patient and their part of it and the third-party payers part of it, it would require more cooperation. I would say we are ready to do our part in that, so that each time we do our internal holistic value assessment, we are looking at the evidence, we're looking at the price, and we are seeking to align them where the measures allow for that.
So thank you, Kyle. Mindy, are you aware of any indication-specific pricing going on that is operative in the asthma space? Know of it in the psoriasis and the RA, the auto, kind of the autoimmune space per se. But are you familiar with whether there are any indication-specific formularies out there in asthma?
No, we have not seen that very often at all, not in the asthma space.
It's interesting. So I'll come back, Kyle, but think for a minute, and I think I know the answer to your question, but part of the question is, if Dupilumab had another future indication and it was even more effective clinically, I would want to say that from a broader system perspective, I want you to have a higher price for it when it's used for that indication. But I don't want you to boost your price for everybody. I want it to be that price for them. And then conversely, I would say, I want you to have that price for atopic dermatitis, but I think you should have a lower price for asthma. And maybe your net price, and again, we try to understand net price. And I know you were talking about the fact that sometimes you have to price in line at the list area with competitors to be able to get onto formularies. But before I go deep into those weeds, let me just let David chime in. David, when you guys are now looking at this landscape, and I know it's really hard because you haven't had the drug approved yet, there's only so much you can say. But somewhere in the bowels of Amgen, there's a slide deck. And the slide deck says, when we come up with a price, we have to think about A, B, C, D, and E. And we could pick this price or that price or that price. Tell us what you can about, and I know you could say certain platitudes, but try to tell us honestly, what happens as you guys weigh these different factors as you come up with your price, as you enter a competitive zone like this? Oops, I'm sorry. It looks like you're off mute, but we're not hearing you.
Better?
Yes, yes.
As you hinted at, we're obviously premature, but as we are, undergoing regulatory reviews. When Kyle went through his Sanofi's approach philosophically to pricing a product, it's not dissimilar from ours. So when we are looking at a space, we kind of try to, one of the first major tenets is pricing the products according to the value that they deliver. And so in that is benefits to patient society, benefits to the overall healthcare systems, benefits to the economy. And then the other element that we try to look at is ensuring that we have a flexible pricing approach to ensure patient access. And this has an element that overlaps with what you were describing in terms of there are other players in the overall healthcare supply chain. But this looks at needs of patients, local health systems, and how we overall think about the general market dynamics and able to ensure that we do have coverage and patients can afford it, and we continue to maintain physician choice, which is one of the other major tenets in this space. So those are kind of all the attributes that we try to look at when we think about pricing a product, a drug.
So, and I know that, you're a for-profit company. So what you want to do in part or mainly is to maximize the return on your investment and the return to your shareholders. That's kind of what the system is set up to have you guys do. And I'm just trying to play this out and going back to Tanya and Melanie again. Do you guys think it's better because we talked about trying to improve, the way that these could be accessible to broad communities, reduce disparities, and everybody knows that price is part of that. Mindy said, if Tezzy is priced high, you could start to see step therapy for the first time. So that's on the table. So does the patient community have a voice here? Alzheimer's Association got out and said, sorry, Biogen, we really, really want this drug. We're pleased that it's in here, but you've way, way overpriced it. What do you guys think about that? Do you have a voice, and would you feel that a lower price would help not only the current patients receiving other biologics, but future patients who we are trying to reach out to?
Melanie, you want to go first, or you want me to speak first this time?
Go ahead, Tanya.
Okay. All right. So I want to address a couple of things that have been said in the last few moments. Number one, around just the data and the way that the pricing is reflected even in the ICER evaluation. Remember, most of the data that is utilized was designed for regulatory approval, not for health economics and outcomes research. So that is, I think, a fundamental issue when we're talking about these valuations. I wholeheartedly agree that we have to have complete system reform. We cannot solely look at pharmaceutical manufacturers and put all the burden there on their response. Absolutely, we need to hold them accountable for responsible pricing, but that's not where all of the issue lies. We still have issues with PBM reform. We still have issues with physician perverse and financial incentives. There are more systemic issues in our healthcare delivery system that are driving some of that inappropriate use. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'll go back to the same statement I made as we came into this session. It's if we all came around the table and really got honest about how do we get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time for the right price with the fewest barriers, we might actually come closer to that rather than, you know, these sort of arbitrary, turn all the focus to the manufacturer, turn all the focus to the PBM, turn all the focus to the perverse incentives by physicians. I think that that's siloing even further rather than looking at more systemic, holistic solutions.
True. I mean, you would acknowledge that the manufacturer gets to set the price as a part of that kind of ecosystem. And I mean, what has your organization done? I know you've probably had documents out on PBMs and coverage. And have you said things about the pricing of treatments, the biologics for asthma?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. We are very well on the record around pricing and holding manufacturers accountable for transparent pricing. But again, that should not be, drug pricing is not solely a manufacturer's. And you heard it from Dave just now, you heard it from Kyle. Some of that is absolutely about how do we gain access through rebates. And so that has to be a more systemic issue that can't solely be on the backs of manufacturers.
And I'm not in any way insinuating that it is, but how to help us now, since we are talking right now about the manufacturer role, how would you have them know what a responsible price is? Do you think it's too high now? Would you like the price to come down? If so, how would you know how low it should be?
I don't think I can make that assessment without looking behind the curtain. I mean, there is apparently some magic curtain that holds all of the data, as you just said, you know, so that certainly is not the patient who sees that and knows. Maybe Mindy would have more information, as she probably gets, you know, the best behind the curtain look at the data when it comes to payer policy and reimbursements and rebates and across manufacturers, but I certainly am not in a position to assess that.
Okay, Melanie, anything about that?
Yeah, the thing that I would add is just that when we've surveyed people with severe asthma and asked them what is their key criteria for choosing an asthma treatment, number one they have picked, is it effective? That's their main driver for choosing a treatment. And then we've asked, what is your rationale for not using your prescribed treatments? What is going into your decision-making for that? Number one, I could not afford it. So if we want people to stay on their medicines, they need to be affordable and accessible. If they can't financially afford it, they will not take it.
That's been my experience as well with patients who are supposed to take twice daily medications, taking it just once a day so that they can, you know, possibly cut the cost in half.
So one of our, and this was developed with patient groups and others, our consensus kind of approach, well, it wasn't consensus, that's too strong a word, but our criteria is that if a drug is fairly priced, it should be on the lowest tier in the formulary. So the lowest out of pocket possible. So we don't care if it's an expensive drug, but if it's priced appropriately to its benefit, it should be on the lowest cost sharing tier. Shouldn't be on that high co-insurance specialty tier. It should be on the preferred brand tier, the lowest out of pocket. So in that way of thinking, the patient benefits the most when the price is judged to be fair. Again, it can be high, low, or intermediate as long as it aligns with the price, with the benefit. And we have that for Dupilumab in atopic dermatitis. We don't have it for these drugs in asthma. So would you like to consider a future in which manufacturers have an incentive to get that price down to a level at which it would be at the lowest cost share for patients? That's kind of connecting the two worlds where the cost sharing for the patient and the price that's chosen by the manufacturer really do hopefully work for the benefit of the patient in basically all ways, accessibility and affordability. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's one solution. I think there are other solutions as well.
Like what?
Rebate reform.
Right. So,
that gets back to the patients.
oh, absolutely. That's absolutely. And I know some of the payers at least are starting to do that, but it's complicated. We have a lot of work to do in that area.
Drug
All right,
price transparency that looks at the entire value chain. I mean, I
Right.
can come up with a few options, but I think that's just one solution.
Right. But you wouldn't be against the idea that if the price is fair, that patients pay the lowest amount out of pocket. That's kind of what you want.
I think it's who's determining fair based off of what data. And again, value and the value assessment to me is not based on equality. So that's where I think it depends on if you are, who is making that fair and value determination.
Right. So that's obviously what ICER tries to do with all of our work between the cost effectiveness and the potential other benefits and the contextual issues. It's trying to build a range within which we can view fair pricing, because what we all want is for that fair price to be rewarded handsomely back to the companies, and to make it a real benefit for the patients so that their accessibility and affordability works, and that we can, again, kind of continue to think about those patients not in the room who ultimately also are trying to afford their health care. So I know we're all driving in the same direction here. But David, as you guys, oh, sorry.
Can I make one point just from the manufacturer's perspective?
Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
Say that affordable access is a key criteria for any Sanofi pricing decision. And yet we're not in control of that, meaning we're not in control of the patient's out of pocket. And this is why we're talking about the relationship between a price and that all important out of pocket. When we hear stories like adherence being impacted by out of pocket, this is just completely unacceptable. And the programs we rely on, say in the case of Dupixent, is the Dupixent My Way, is the patient support program that's meant to address exactly those issues. We want them used to their fullest extent. We want them used for their design purpose, which is to benefit the patient where a prescribing decision has been made, and we want to encourage it being followed in every way possible. Least of all, suffering from economic barriers that ultimately become more expensive, whether it be to the payer, to the system, to the patient. It ultimately becomes more expensive when they're not controlled for the condition and the treatment that they've been prescribed.
Right. Tony, let me let you get a word in if you'd like, because then I want to turn to research issues before we close up. But you heard that kind of conversation as it went around pricing and whether it's fair and whether that means lower out of pocket or not. Any comments on how you think the system could work better for patients?
Again, I think it's kind of like what Tanya was saying earlier is everybody has to be approaching it together as a team, and we can't be working at this from a silo approach anymore. That, again, that's the value of having discussions like this. That's the value of having the discussions with our provider community as well, as a payer, and so that we're all aligned and on the same page. It's kind of, again, echoing what Tanya said. We feel at the company is, we look at things at the right place, at the right time, the right care. We don't have in our goals of doing that. We don't say at the right cost as well. It's, we're looking at the right place, right time, right care, and that's the way to move forward and working with everybody else.
Well, I think all of your subscribers hope you're paying attention to the cost too.
Well, I think they are, as are the clients. I mean, I think that's the other thing that we have to keep in mind too, is we have to have them at the table so that they have the understanding as well. The people that are purchasing the products, whether it's the employers who have the commercial insurance. We also have to remember, there's the government product line. So we've got, all of us as taxpayers have to be vested in this as well. And I think that's what people need to understand. Earlier on, what I liked about the kickoff of this meeting is, yes, we got to think about the individual consumer of this product, but how is it affecting us as a society as well? And where the healthcare dollars are spent as well. And that's what I mean, bringing everybody together so that everybody understands it. It's much more complex than what people realize.
Okay, so let's talk about future research. We heard several things today that I thought would be important to kind of note, but I also wanted to raise the issue of real world evidence, because I have a feeling, we're probably never going to get head-to-head trials of these biologics in the real world in a formal kind of trial. So a lot of people are going to be using real world evidence to make competitive issues, to make pricing claims, whatever it might be. So let's talk what would some recommendations be? How could we make sure that real world evidence is used correctly to help us learn more about these biologics, to help inform patients and clinicians going forward? And obviously the manufacturers have a large role to play here because they have an incentive to use real world evidence to try to make claims that their drugs, again, have competitive benefits. So Kyle, I know this is a lot of what you do in your day job. So what are some important recommendations that everybody should be doing around real world evidence so that it's not misused or poorly produced?
Well, first are the standards. I think just like good clinical practice, following the standards for good epidemiological practice in the conduct of research, so that it is always valid and reliable. We regard it the same way we've been interrogating the clinical evidence for the past several hours. So having standards, adhering to the guidelines that exist, doing it properly, so it contributes to good science. Having said that, it's the complementary nature, not the competitive nature with clinical trials, but as it complements clinical practice, it can access populations that we've found difficult to access through our clinical studies, even though we're committed to doing better. So that if we look at that complementary nature and recognize RWE fits into the larger picture. And then lastly is the partnership. What's so important to the success of our trials is that any manufacturer does not do them in isolation. It is a partnership from, say, preclinical all the way to approval and beyond, and well through the life cycle of the product. So some of the successful collaborations we've had have been when we talk to a third-party payer about a question that we can answer with them, with their data, rather than something we have internal. So those are, I believe, the most successful RWE activities that go from concept through design, through execution, and to communication.
So David, thank you. David, what are you going to do? I'm also specifically, can you say, should basically everybody go out and do real world evidence on emergency room visits and hospitalization? Those are easy to get from claims databases. Are people going to go out and do that and compare Tezzy versus Dupi in a while and look at ED and hospital? And is that the right way to start to judge some of the comparative effectiveness between the two?
I think there are some meta-analyses that have value. I think that the first step for us would be to address some of the issues that you guys found with our study in terms of the understudy groups that we haven't included to date. So, I mentioned earlier, we're finalizing a study protocol it is real world evidence in a phase 4 clinical study, highlighting some of these groups, i.e. Black Americans, patients that were excluded from the phase 3 trials, patients with comorbid COPD and significant smoking history. That to us feels like, a very logical first step. And I also agree with Kyle in terms of accessible data on the payer side, being rational about this. This can sometimes be addressed through things like value-based partnerships to make sure that this is a unification between the two entities and really understanding what's happening in the real world.
Great.
This is Mike.
Mike.
I think one of the key questions, I think two areas where we don't really have good answers other than what was just mentioned in terms of looking at minority groups and healthcare disparity issues. One is, can we identify a predictive and perhaps a response biomarker that may predict who is most likely to benefit from one therapy versus another? The way I believe this is going to be marketed in the future is, oh, you don't need a biomarker. This is a one-size-fits-all approach. But that seems to be counter to the whole movement towards precision medicine. The other area of research, which I think would be worthwhile to pursue, would be, since we've been asking for comparative data, why not? I mean, I know why. I know the answer to this question. But why not do demonstrates of one therapy versus another, and or to demonstrate, help us identify who is most likely to respond to which therapy? across the board. Those would be
Good.
two major areas that I would think about
Good.
about working on.
Yeah. Now, figuring out ways to find biomarkers or characteristics so that we can know when we first prescribe a drug that it has a higher chance of working for that patient. I see a whole lot of benefit in doing more work like that as these drugs continue to come out. Okay, folks, this was a fantastic policy roundtable. I do want to end by actually giving each of you a last chance to say something. For those of you who have done this with us before, we'd like to ask you, if you can, to keep it to one sentence with the allowance of a precisely placed semicolon can get you another breath, but not a paragraph. And what would we like you to talk about? Anything you want. What do you want to be the major theme that this report hits coming out of this policy roundtable, or the whole thing? What's an undersung thing that has been mentioned but not enough, or just the most important thing? Or it could be a request. Sometimes we get really interesting requests, like, I would like to request of the payers this, or of the manufacturers that, or the clinical specialists the other. Something that you think is the critical piece, or one of them, to make the world a better place going forward as we continue to generate evidence, assess it, try to figure out how it should be linked to pricing and to coverage. What's a request you would have of a stakeholder at the table today? So I want you to think about that. I want to let the patients have the last word in this regard. So I'd like to start with the manufacturers, if you don't mind. David, what would you like to say as your final statement as we head out?
I like going first to make sure that what I get to say is novel. As we heard from Monique when she described the burden of this disease, tragically yet eloquently, as the villain that sneaks back into Javen's lungs, the recognition that this burden is dismayingly high, and I think that's where my semicolon goes. I'm excited at the prospect that Tezepelumab, as the first and only biologic to consistently and significantly reduce asthma exacerbations in a broad population of patients with severe asthma, has the potential to alleviate some of this horrific burden.
Thank you. Kyle?
Okay. I'll have a few semicolons as well.
One.
Okay. We are all playing a critical role in bringing innovative medicines to patients who need them, either directly in the case of manufacturer and many investigators and patient groups, or indirectly through forums like the one we've just had for the past several hours. And we are advancing science rapidly. But unfortunately, this great science is not reaching everyone, as we've been talking about today. It is not reaching Monique. It is not reaching Javen as it should. We can do better, and we have to do better. And at Sanofi, we are looking for ways to do better because we cannot get to our goals alone, which is to reach all patients and give them the best opportunity for the lives and health that they could achieve.
Thank you. Thank you. Mindy, what do you think? What's going to make the world a better place?
So Dr. Weschler kind of mentioned this already, but I think one thing we didn't talk quite enough about until the end here is precision medicine, and really discovering which biomarkers can tell us which patients will respond the best. And so we get it right more often than not, and reduce delay in getting the right treatment to the patient, and reduce just waste in healthcare dollars spent on drugs that don't work.
Thanks. Tony, your first policy roundtable, you're almost out of it alive. Your last statement.
I would say, the other thing that we have to do is we have to always keep in mind the end users. We can come together and build something fantastic, and it makes perfect sense to us and have all these recommendations, but it has to make sense to the providers and to the recipients of this medication as to why it's administered this way, why these are the steps you have to go through to be on this medication. These are the criteria, and as well, this is the price of the medicine that you have to pay as well.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, Michael.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you all for allowing me to participate in this really, really important discussion and participate in this process. I think it's critical to the development of new therapies and administration, and will help our patients. So that isn't my sentence. My sentence is, though, I'm really excited about the prospect of having a novel therapy for my patients. I continue to have many patients who remain poorly controlled despite the utilization of biologic therapies. And I'm excited to have a novel therapy that will work to help my patients address their symptoms, exacerbations, needs, etc.
Thank you. And that was very, very tricky of you to get in that extra sentence. I'm going to have to figure out how to stop. No, I'm kidding. Well done. And thank you for your participation. The entire team has been very, very appreciative of your contributions throughout the whole time of the review. Okay, coming into the final phase now. You guys get to thumb wrestle. Who'd like to go first in the last set? Tanya or Melanie?
Go ahead, Melanie. I'll go.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited today. I would encourage treating patients as equal partners throughout the entire process. And on the question of health equity, would encourage even conversations like the one we had today to have more diverse representation included.
Understood. Thank you, Melanie. Tanya.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here. Uncontrolled severe asthma patients want and need new treatment options. Tezepelumab clearly provides that net health benefit for these patients. Our system needs significant change to ensure a true shared decision-making approach to get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time with the fewest barriers to really address the unmet patient needs and what matters most to patients.
Thank you. Folks, you guys are really, really generous and wonderful spokespeople for your own thoughts and those of really important people that we hope to hear from at each of these meetings. So I know on behalf of the entire CEPAC, I'd like to thank you. You are very welcome to stay for the final few minutes in which we turn it back over to them for their final comments. But seriously, on behalf of the entire ICER team and on behalf of the Midwest CEPAC, I'd really like to applaud your contributions today. I'll make a comment at the very end about how important this is for payers and for all the different policymakers to hear. But thank you all. Reem, can I hand it back over to you to go through the CEPAC and let them have their final say as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve, and thanks everyone. I'm just going to start by thanking you, Steve, and ICER for bringing us together. And I want to thank everybody who participated in the policy roundtable. Really a fantastic round, excellent points for discussion, which we appreciate. I'm just going to start with the CEPAC members, and I'll actually go last for my sentence. So we're going to go in different order than we started this morning. Why don't we start with Stuart?
Thank you. This wasn't the first CEPAC meeting, nor will it be the last, where the shortcomings of standard of care have been brought to light. When the placebo effect gives us that much of improvement, we know we have so much more work to do. And everyone in front of us here needs to commit to improving the care. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. Rachel?
Sure. I'm sure I speak for, my fellow panelists in thanking all of the patients, the clinicians, the economic experts, and the ICER team for all of their work as part of this process. But for myself, I want to say something about industry, which is just that it's a choice to select particular academic medical centers as trial sites that may be less representative of the diversity of patients that are involved here. It's a choice not to run head-to-head trials to generate the types of comparative effectiveness data that providers and patients are desperately asking for. And it's a choice to set high prices, which even high net prices are out of reach for too many patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Tim McBride.
I wanted to just say ditto to my friend Rachel on that, but and ditto to the hard work of the panel and the patients, the industry representatives. But I've been sitting here struggling throughout the whole meeting about how we really don't know enough about how asthma affects people of color, and we won't know it until we study it. You know, if we submit a grant and we don't put people in our study, it gets rejected by the federal government. You know, and it's more than just about biology. It's about a lot more things than that. It's, you know, I study rural America. There are people that live in the rural South who are Black. There are people that live in the rural South that are, you know, Hispanics. There's people that live in the rural Southwest that are Latinos, and there's Native Americans. You know, we just need to do a lot better on all that. And until we study this, we won't know more about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Jill?
Again, thank you for including me in this conversation. I think that clinical comparative effectiveness is a great place to start. And I think one thing that ICER has done always is have such a varied number of stakeholders. The facets are all relatively represented, except for I had a thought about, you know, how the FDA's charge of getting drugs to market is always versus placebo, and it's sometimes an arbitrary measure that is not what clinicians are looking for. And especially when we're looking at high cost drugs and we're making policies to either allow or constrain access, it occurred to me, would it be possible, or would ICER be interested in including an FDA representative in the stakeholder discussion? So thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Something important for ICER to think about. Heather?
Well, yeah, I just absolutely want to echo everybody here's sentiment, and, you know, say thank you, of course, first and foremost to the patients who have bravely shared their stories. You know, this is my first time on this side of the ICER table. I've been on the other side, so I know how much courage that takes. And it reminds us all, you know, the old sentiment, nothing about us without us. And that is one of the things that ICER does very, very well. And I'm very, very proud to be a part of this panel. So I just want to say thank you. And also, again, echo the sentiments that, you know, we really need to drill down more on the under-resourced among us from a diversity perspective, socioeconomic, because when we say nothing about us without us, we mean everybody. But thank you to ICER, and thank you to all the panelists and all the colleagues here today. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Heather. Sneha?
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is also my first Midwest CEPAC, and so I really enjoyed listening in. It was a really, really fantastic day. I'd kind of echo what everyone else said before, in that I think intersectionality needs to be a forethought. I think, frankly, it's unacceptable to have the percentage of marginalized groups that were represented in the study today. I think this needs to be an issue in the 21st century, that we just can't settle to complete a study without including everyone. And that also includes age as well. I represent the adolescent young adult patient demographic, and I definitely think that historically we have been underrepresented in a lot of studies. Also, just thinking about the fact that more and more of us are being diagnosed as kids, and so we're transitioning into this adult period. And so I think there needs to be a lot more rigor for our age demographic. But thank you all for being here and for allowing me to be on this panel today.
Thank you, Sneha. Great to have you on the panel. Don?
Yeah, thanks again for this. It was really fantastic. And Steve, I think Sneha just gave you your first quality measure, which would be to actually take the counts of people that you wish were more represented in these studies and increase those. So I would start there. I also think that Steve's point, which was emphasized as well by David Zimmer, regarding the next step past the entry-level trials that get you through the FDA, be pragmatic clinical trials and focus on real-world evidence. I was struck by the presence of obesity and rhinosinusitis in these populations, and it only made me wonder why we wouldn't focus on weight reduction and screening and treating obstructive sleep apnea simultaneously for some of these people. So I think that's it. And then I think to Mike Wexler's point, this notion of precision medicine, the pictures from New England Journal with all the interleukins are nice, but that's not really the real story. That's kind of where we are in terms of understanding. And just to give you my own personal jaw-dropping experience last week at the Heart Association, a friend of mine who is a heart failure specialist was on stage with the Moderna CEO, and the talk turned to focusing on mRNA in terms of seeing if the cardiomyocytes that are in advanced heart failure could be returned to the fetal state. So we've got a long way to go in terms of understanding the cell biology of this disease. So thank you.
Thanks, Don. Aaron?
I don't want to repeat what everyone else has said, but I'm struck that too often I still feel like we're even just looking at data on efficacy and not effectiveness, because we're not really seeing what's going to happen in the real world. These drugs are employed, but I remain grateful to be part of this group and that everyone participates in this process and that it is open and public and civil. I just wish there was more of it.
Thanks, Aaron. Angela?
Thanks again for the great panel and discussion that we've had today. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I think I echo what many people have already said. It is hard being closer to the end, but just the piece with disparities and really thinking about those communities of color. I think one of the things that was a key takeaway for me from this pandemic is really how do we have those with the lived experience at the table throughout the process, and really how do we begin to model that in some of this other work to really begin to have impact in many of these communities that are most impacted by these disparities. So that was my key takeaway, but again, thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, Angela. Very important perspective. Kurt?
Yeah, I don't think I can add a lot. Great discussion. Thanking panelists, to ICER, and we've come a long ways with treating severe asthma from Primatene Mist, 40 to 50 years ago, to all the therapies we have today, but we're not done, obviously. This drug is interesting to me because it's a different mechanism of action, but I also wonder about long-term safety. So thank you again for the participation and discussion.
Thanks, Kurt. Alan?
Sorry, somebody just showed up at my door and the dog is going nuts. I knew you would come to me right in the middle of the chaos here. So my apologies. The only thing I wanted to add, and that's the nice thing about going last, thank you for reversing the order, is I agree with everything that's been said so far. I want to reiterate the thank you to the ICER team and to everybody who contributed their insights and thoughts, particularly the patients themselves and the advocates on behalf of patients. Really appreciated the perspective you brought and the ability of ICER to bring those perspectives into the conversation robustly and early and often. The only thing I would add, and it sort of picks on something else that has been said already, I won't put it in the context of a directive, but as far as we're concerned, I think it may be something that's relevant here is, we're really challenging ourselves to think about health equity, through a couple different lenses. Racial and ethnic disparities and populations are certainly the primary area or lens through which to look at it, but age, socioeconomic status, issues like housing, transportation, disability. We don't need to think of everybody. It's not an N of one type of thing, but there are definitely subpopulations of patients that we need to think about, starting with racial and ethnic groups, but then certainly going beyond that to when we're trying to think about benefit, efficacy, risk, all those factors. It's nothing new to the ICER team, and I know these are hard. The world is not geared right now to think in those terms, as everything from clinical trials to the FDA to how we gather data, but it's trending that way. And I really think ICER can be on the cutting edge of pushing that envelope of how to bring, and the contextual considerations is a start, but I really think the conversation today it made me think it's really time to start pushing the envelope in terms of defining what subpopulations and how we define different characteristics and archetypes of patients, so we really understand what's important to them and whether or not all services, but obviously medications in particular, are delivering services that really matter to to patients of different types.
Thank you, Alan. And Eric?
Sure. Let's see. I'll just say I think it highlights two things for me that I'll use in teaching, right? Because this is a great case for the type of work that we do with med students and public health students. But one is this case highlights the tension between a clinical indicator of success, that is exacerbation reduction, right? Versus the PRO that was used, right? Whether it was perfect or imperfect, but this case to me just sort of sums it all up really well. Of the tension between those two. And then I think the second one for me, and I can't remember who Stuart may have mentioned it, like, you know, as a public health asthma professional, right, I think we should just put everybody in a clinical trial, right? Because it turns out if you're just in the placebo arm in this particular trial, just getting good quality care that is associated with participation in a clinical trial was incredibly effective. And I'm not saying it's the placebo, it's the standard of care that people got that actually made substantial improvements. And there's just two gems that come out of this particular case, in addition to the wonderful, you know, discussion and dialogue from all of the participants today. So thanks a lot, Reem, for facilitating a great group today. And Steve, always just spectacular work.
Thank you, Eric. Eric, you took a couple of my points. That makes it easy, which is, so I fully agree. You know, my take-home message, in addition to agreeing with all of you, I do think one of the issues is the lack of responsive tools to assess patient improvement. So, which is an important thing that for future trials, I think that would be worth further work to ensure that these tools are validated to capture patient-reported outcomes, but also that are responsive to care. I don't think we can highlight enough the need to have the mandate. We really need to all mandate and require that in this day and age, it can't be that trials are not representative of who we are, who the patients are. It's just not acceptable anymore. And I think we should all mandate that in different ways. Before I end, I want to thank all the CEPAC members for very thoughtful, engaging discussion, but also for their willingness to be quite transparent publicly about their thoughts, which we all need to do to kind of move this discussion forward. Dave and Britt, thanks for an excellent, and the teams with you for an excellent report, wonderful presentations, really trying to summarize very complex topics into short times and papers. Thanks to the patients who were willing to be with us today, share their experience. We really appreciate it, and we heard you. And we're trying to work together to I'm gonna borrow from you, Tanya, to actually find the right treatment for the right patient at the right time at the right price to get the best outcome. Thanks all. Steve, thank you for moderating. Back to you.
Oh, thank you guys. CEPAC, fantastic job. You guys, as always, really, I thought were incredibly thoughtful, probing about the evidence, and also great listeners, and connecting with some of the broader aspects of value that we really try to bring into these meetings. I also have to re-thank the patient community, partly because it's easy to think of their contributions today, but it goes way back. And Tanya and Melanie and Kenny and others, you know, it goes back to talking to us before we have a scoping document. It involves reading our scoping document. It includes, you know, comments on everything all the way through. And it's a lot of time and it's a lot of work. And we couldn't do what we do even remotely well without your contributions. So thank you again to the entire group of patients and representatives who helped us. A couple quick reflections. One is, again, one of the things I loved about today is that it highlighted severe asthma is absolutely horrible. It is frightening. It is life limiting. It is being on chronic steroids or even intermittent pulses. Again, I talked to you earlier, and probably big surprise, it was my wife, that this woman I was talking about, she almost died. She had pneumomediastinum. That's when air cracks into your chest because you're breathing so hard and trying to force the air out. She was on chronic steroids for years, and and we didn't have anything. We had all, just inhalers, and it was a miserable experience. And so part of what I know also from having sat in the rooms with payers and even other doctors, when you say asthma, even to most primary care doctors, they think of either the average or for them, the average is really not that sick and relatively well controlled with inhalers. And so I'm proud that this meeting, I think it will contribute to a deeper understanding among clinicians and payers around when we talk about severe asthma, what do we mean? And what are we talking about in terms of the burden of illness? So that's really important. And the quality of life, again, I know Tanya and I will certainly differ on the ways that quality of life can be captured and brought into evaluation. But I'm convinced that if we have a condition like this, where you are that sick, that actually the tools may not be that bad. We don't have treatments yet that can really make huge improvements in patients' quality of life. These are important advances, absolutely. But we're still waiting, and there's still a tremendous amount of unmet need. And we need the companies to invest in that. We need new science. We need a lot of research to get there. But we absolutely have a pot of gold waiting for treatments that do really boost the quality of life for patients with asthma. And so in some sense, we could have done a threshold analysis where, we could have shown if you do improve the quality of life X amount, how much the drugs would have been worth. But it's there, and it's just yet to be accomplished. And so this new drug Tezepelumab, like many others, I just think it's an example of the best and in some cases the worst of our healthcare system. It represents, again, all that work and effort and investment and that ecosystem of which patients are a very important part. And yet it's coming into a system in which it's going to be priced at a level that's going to make it hard to afford by individual patients and by the system. And this entire area, according to the best metrics we can come up with, in which we've said that 2.1 million is okay for some treatments, but at this level for this treatment, it seems too high. And it's building a kind of a growing list of drugs for asthma that aren't priced in alignment with that benefit that they're providing yet. So that's a problem. And I just think we have to acknowledge that there are lots of ways that we can work on making things more affordable, sucking out all the waste that can possibly be accomplished throughout all parts of the health system, but particularly the drug delivery system. But the pricing is a choice at the front end of a long stream of other things that also helps set a very important problem for the system to grapple with. So the celebration is there very much. I think patients should really welcome this treatment and the others as they've come in. I think we all have work to do to get them out in a more kind of equitable fashion. And we talked a lot about that today. So I look forward to capturing those recommendations and the broader context of today's meeting in our final report. And I hope we can come back in another few years with some more great treatments that are doing even more for patients and can be hopefully found cost effective. And that's where I feel like a true celebration will be had by all. So thank you again for your participation today. We miss meeting in person, but we appreciate the personalities and the humanity that you bring to these Zoom calls. And we'll put the report up in a couple of weeks. I think the last slide will show some of those details, but I hope you all are well and look forward to working with you the next time around. Thank you.
So, bye.